right, anybody else have any questions before we start? All right, great. Let's try to keep the time in consideration. If I tell you you have 1 minute, it's because you've already demonstrated enough to me. Don't take it personally, and it's not because of the time now. You're just being fair to the other side. Mr. Leroy, whenever you are ready.
May it please the court. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I appreciate your willingness to serve here today. My name is Nicholas Leroy, and along with my co-counsel seated over here to the left, Ms. Stacy Cohen, represent the state. I'll be making the opening remarks for this case. This is a case about responsibility, taking responsibility for your actions. Desperate times call for desperate measures, but those desperate measures should never include committing criminal acts. Committing criminal acts is never an option. Unfortunately, that is not the case today. You are here today because the defendant, Bonnie Lynch, along with 2 other men, knowingly joined a partnership and in the process disregarded the law for her own benefit. Now, year 2 was a very difficult year for the defendant, Bonnie Lynch. In January, the defendant and her husband were separated. In June, the defendant and her husband were divorced. Soon after, the defendant's ex-husband packed up his things and moved to California, leaving Bonnie and her young daughter, Gretchen, behind. The next month, in July of year 2, Bonnie Lynch lost a very good job. This made her depressed. She was forced to work as a teacher to make ends meet. As a teacher, she made less money. The teaching position was supposed to be temporary. In fact, she was only supposed to work as a teacher for 1 month, or 1 semester rather. Now, it was very important for Bonnie to maintain her above average lifestyle, so finding alternate employment that paid better was a must. But the job search wasn't going well. Bonnie Lynch wasn't having much luck at all finding a new job. The teaching salary that she was making wasn't enough to pay her bills. She couldn't afford her rent. To make matters worse, her daughter got sick and the medical bills started to add up and she couldn't afford those either. She became more and more depressed. Now that all changed on September 30th of year 2. On that night, Bonnie was at home and received a telephone call from an old friend, Jesse Nolan. Now, Jesse told Bonnie that a friend had contacted him named Frank Adams and needed a place to stay for a few days. Now, Frank Adams is a courier for an organized crime syndicate. On September 20th of year 2, his employer asked him to deliver $15,000 to Dallas, Texas, to a Mr. John Jones. Mr. John Jones is the Director of Public Works for the City of Dallas. The transfer of this $15,000 to Mr. John Jones was for him to grant the City of Dallas a Public Works contract. Now on September 23rd, shortly after Mr. Frank Adams received the funds, the $15,000 from Little Rock, Arkansas, a federal warrant was issued for his arrest. Now, moving on ahead to September 30th, the night Bonnie received that phone call, Bonnie realized that she stood to make a great deal of money if she helped Frank Adams. This was her opportunity to improve her financial situation. This was her way out. Bonnie Lynch agreed to let Mr. Adams stay with her from October 1st until October 4th. The next morning, October 1st, Mr. Jesse Nolan drove Frank Adams to the residence of Bonnie Lynch. Now, Bonnie invited Frank into her home. She showed Frank to his room where he'd be staying for the next few days. Later that afternoon, Frank Adams delivered $1,000 payment to Bonnie Lynch. Now, 2 days later, on October 3rd, Bonnie Lynch made false statements to her landlady, Ms. Elma Richards. she told Ms. Richards that Frank was just a friend. She also told Ms. Richards that Frank was not staying with her. The next night, October 4th of year 2, Bonnie went to the residence of Ms. Richards. Bonnie asked Ms. Richards for directions to the Texarkana bus station. Bonnie returned home, got Frank Adams, got in her vehicle, and drove Frank Adams across state lines to the Texarkana, Texas bus station. She got out of the car. Bonnie went into the bus station. She purchased a ticket for Frank Adams to travel to Dallas, Texas. She got back in her car. Frank, still in her car, she gave Frank the ticket. Frank got out of the car, went around the back of the bus station, and Bonnie left. Now the next morning, October 5th of year 2, Frank arrived in Dallas. At 4 a.m., he met with Mr. John Jones at the Dallas bus station. 2 federal agents at the bus station saw Frank Adams pass an envelope to Mr. John Jones. They approached to make an arrest. In the altercation that ensued, Frank Adams was shot and killed by the 2 federal agents. Now, the envelope found at the scene contained $15,000, and a ticket stub was found on the person of Frank Adams. That ticket stub indicated that his origin was Texarkana, Texas. And that ticket stub was the ticket that Bonnie Lynch purchased for Frank Adams. Now, throughout the evidence and testimony that you're going to hear today, 3 questions are going to be answered and proven beyond a reasonable doubt. Those 3 questions are: did the defendant actually travel across state lines with the intention of promoting an unlawful act? Did the defendant conspire to travel across state lines with the purpose of promoting an unlawful act? And third, did the defendant conspire to willfully and knowingly harbor and conceal Frank Adams, a suspected felon? Now, to count 1 up here, the first question: did the defendant actually travel across state lines? We're going to need to prove 3 elements. We're going to first need to prove that the defendant traveled in interstate commerce at the time and place charged. We're going to need to prove that the defendant traveled in interstate commerce for the purpose of promoting and carrying out an unlawful activity. And third, we're going to have to prove that the travel was done willfully and knowingly by the defendant. Now, willfully means voluntarily, means intentionally. It means with the specific intent of doing something that the law forbids. Now, as to question number 2 and 3 in regard to the conspiracy, a conspiracy is simply something where 2 or more people, a combination of 2 or more people, come together to accomplish something unlawful, an unlawful purpose by unlawful means. We need 4 elements. The state will prove that the conspiracy was willfully formed. The state will prove that the defendant, Bonnie Lynch, willfully joined the conspiracy. The state will prove the defendant, Bonnie Lynch, committed a criminal act. And the state will prove that the defendant, Bonnie Lynch, criminal act furthered the conspiracy. Now, later on today, you're going to hear some testimony from Mr. Jesse Nolan. And Jesse Nolan is going to tell you that he introduced Frank Adams to the defendant, Bonnie Lynch. Mr. Nolan is further going to testify that defendant, Bonnie Lynch, readily agreed to take in Frank Adams and help in any way that she could when she realized that Frank Adams would deliver payment for the services she provided. You are also going to hear testimony from Ms. Elma Richards. Ms. Richards is going to testify that she witnessed the defendant, Bonnie Lynch, have Frank Adams at her residence and stay with her from October 1st until October 4th. Ms. Richards is also going to testify that on the evening of October 4th, Bonnie came to her residence and asked for directions to the Texarkana bus station. Now, in a few moments, the defense is going to get up here and they are going to tell you their side of the story. And they are going to tell you that Bonnie Lynch was unaware of any conspiracy. And they're going to tell you Bonnie Lynch was manipulated by her friend Jesse Nolan. They will have the burden of proving this to you. It will not be easy. They have a very difficult mountain to climb. Make sure they climb it. Now, speaking of the burden of proof, this is a criminal case. And in a criminal case, the burden of proof is proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Proof beyond a reasonable doubt is proof of such convincing character that you would be willing to act upon it in your daily lives. Now, one of the most important tools that we have is our common sense. And common sense tells us desperate times call for desperate measures. But common sense does not tell us to commit criminal acts to better our financial situations. At the end of trial today, we will ask you to return a verdict of guilty, because that is the only verdict supported by the evidence, the law, and justice. Thank you.
Thank you. Defense?
We are never more vulnerable than when we trust someone. And Miss Lynch trusted Mr. Nolan. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen of the jury. My name is Sam Goldberg, and this is my co-counsel, Joe Magdovitz, and we represent the defendant, Ms. Bonnie Lynch. The prosecution has wrongfully accused Ms. Lynch of various unlawful activities, and after the trial today, we will prove to you that she lacked the requisite intent as well as knowledge to commit any of the things that are filed against her today. Evidence and testimony will show that Ms. Lynch went to college at University State of Michigan. She got a Bachelor of Science degree in mathematics. Ms. Lynch moved to Texarkana because she got a job at a computer technological firm. While Ms. Lynch moved to Texarkana, she bumped into her old friend Jesse Nolan. She knew Jesse Nolan since he was 5 years old. They went to elementary school together, and they went to junior high school together. They were neighbors. The families knew each other. As soon as they bumped into each other again, they once again hit it off and became best friends. While Ms. Lynch was living in Texarkana, she met her husband. They got married. They had a child named Gretchen, who was currently 3 years old. They recently got divorced, and while the divorce was going on, she spoke to Mr. Nolan about this divorce. The computer technological firm closed down due to resizing, so Ms. Lynch got a job as a teacher. She teaches at Texarkana High School, teaching mathematics, and being a teacher is a very respectable job. She is molding the minds of young people.
Objection, relevance.
Just relevance, sustained as to argument.
On the night of September 30th, Ms. Lynch received a telephone call from Mr. Nolan. Mr. Nolan told her that Mr. Adams had come to his house and was currently involved in a divorce. The reason that he had come to his house was because Mrs. Adams was trying to find him, as well as Mrs. Adams' lawyers, because a divorce proceeding was going on, and he wanted to be clear of Mrs. Adams. Mr. Nolan then told Ms. Lynch that she would like Mr. Adams to stay at her house for the next 3 nights. Ms. Lynch was a little skeptical about inviting him to stay because she didn't know him, but in the end, she decided to allow him to stay at her house because of the friendship that her and Mr. Nolan had. This was a best friend asking her to do him a favor, so she decided to allow Mr. Nolan's friend, Mr. Adams, to stay with her for the next 3 nights. On the morning of October 1st, Ms. Lynch started thinking to herself, and she decided to call her brother. Her brother came over and she told him what was going on about how Mr. Nolan wanted Mr. Adams to stay with her for 3 nights. Her brother said, "We've known Mr. Nolan since we were 5 years old. If it's one of his friends, I'm sure it's okay. Why don't you meet him and make your decision once you meet him?" Ms. Lynch thought this was a good idea. After that, Mr. Nolan and Mr. Adams arrived at her house, and once he arrived, Mr. Adams seemed quiet, and Ms. Lynch decided to allow Mr. Adams to stay at her house. Prior to Mr. Nolan leaving, he once again told Ms. Lynch in private how important it was to keep it private that Mr. Adams was staying at her house. And the reason once again given was his wife, Mrs. Adams, was looking for him as well as Mrs. Adams' lawyers, and he did not want to be found. Mr. Nolan and her brother left the apartment, and later that evening, Miss Lynch and Mr. Adams had a conversation. They were talking, and he was complimenting her on her house. And Miss Lynch said, yeah, it's been a rough month. My daughter got very, very sick. I've had to pay medical bills. It's been rough. I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to make my rent. Well, Mr. Adams, out of the graciousness of his heart, decided to give Miss Lynch $1,000. Miss Lynch at first didn't want to take the money, but then she felt, why shouldn't I take the money? So she took the $1,000. On October 3rd, Miss Lynch paid the landlord. She paid her rent. And then on October 4th, Miss Lynch took Mr. Adams to the bus station. He was running late for the bus, so while he went to the bathroom, Miss Lynch agreed to buy his ticket. You're going to hear testimony today from Robert Beasley, who is Miss Lynch's brother. Robert Beasley will testify to the fact that Miss Lynch is a good mother, she's a hard worker. He will also testify to the fact that he was at Miss Lynch's house the day that Mr. Nolan brought Mr. Adams over to her house for the first time. You're also going to hear testimony from Miss Alma Richards. Miss Alma Richards will testify that she saw Mr. Adams from her house in Miss Lynch's house. She will testify that she was clearly able to see inside Miss Lynch's house and see Mr. Adams on the couch. Now you're also going to hear from Mr. Nolan. It's very important to remember when Mr. Nolan is testifying that he has been given a grant of immunity. And what that means is he is not going to be put on trial for any of the unlawful activities that he has committed. Mr. Nolan now has admitted to knowing that Mr. Adams had a warrant out for his arrest. He has admitted to knowing that Mr. Adams was going to Texas to bribe a public official. He has admitted to knowing that he was a co-conspirator. He has admitted to knowing the fact that by putting Mr. Adams at Miss Lynch's house, he was furthering the crime. It's also important to remember that the prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt. The defense does not have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt. That was a mistake that they made in their testimony. So the prosecution must prove beyond a reasonable doubt. And there's 3 counts to be proven. The first count is that the defendant traveled in interstate commerce with the intent to promote and facilitate the carrying on of an unlawful activity. Now, in order to prove count 1, there are 3 elements, A, B, and C. They have to prove each one of these. If one of these is not proven, Ms. Lynch cannot be found guilty of count 1. Now, the elements needed to prove this is the defendant traveled in interstate commerce at the time and place in the indictment, that such travel is for the purpose of promoting and facilitating the carrying on of an unlawful activity, and C, that such travel and activity was willfully and knowingly done by the defendant. Count 2. The defendant conspired to travel in interstate commerce with the intent to promote and facilitate the carrying on of an unlawful activity. Once again, here are 4 elements. They have to prove each and every single one of these elements. If one of these elements is not proven, Ms. Lynch needs to be found not guilty. The elements that need to be proven is that the conspiracy described in the indictment was willfully formed, that the accused willfully became a member of the conspiracy, and that the conspirator thereafter knowingly committed at least one of the overt acts. And finally, count 3. The defendant conspired to willfully and knowingly harbor and conceal a person for whose arrest a federal warrant on a felony charge has been issued so as to prevent his discovery and arrest, and that she performed one or more overt acts to promote and facilitate the conspiracy. These 4 elements in count 3 are the same as count 2. And if one of these elements is not proven, you cannot find Ms. Lynch guilty of count 3. And if you notice, if you look at all 3 of these, there's one common theme in all of them. Count 1, knowingly. Count 2, knowingly. Count 3, knowingly. We are going to prove to you today that Ms. Lynch did not know she was housing a convicted felon. She did not know that she was housing a man with a warrant out for his arrest. She did not know anything was going on. She just thought she was helping out a best friend. A friend in need was a friend of hers, and she was there for him. Thank you.